Welcome to another episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the weekly podcast Film Seizure and host of Monster Mondays, both of which you can find here at filmseizure.com. This time, I'm going to take a look at maybe pretty much the most substantial and large-scale science fiction film to be released to the public since maybe Star Wars The Force Awakens back in 2015. And I'm talking about Denis Villeneuve's adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune. Now, I do want to set some things straight here at the beginning. First, I don't really intend to give away any major spoilers, so please listen without fear of things being ruined for you. However, if you are a fan of the Herbert series, then you probably already know a lot of what's happening in this movie or what will happen to some characters along the way. Now, that does bring up the second thing that I do want to set straight. I really do not know the books. I don't read too many books, especially ones with the size of the Dune books. If I did, I'd probably be reviewing books and not movies. So that leaves the third thing I want to say at the top here. I can only review and speak to what the movie is doing and how I'm perceiving that. Now, going into this movie, my only previous knowledge of Dune came primarily from the truly baffling 1984 version directed by David Lynch. That mess of a movie is wildly incoherent and almost dares me to never get interested or invested in anything happening to my eyeballs. I know the series of novels are beloved, and I know a lot of people really wanted to see what Jodorowsky, for example, what his version would have been if it could have been realized. From everything I understood about that vision Jodorowsky had built with the highly acclaimed French comic book artist Moebius, it very well could have been far more influential than even Star Wars. So while simply uttering the title Dune, you can perk a lot of people's ears up. But to me, though, it's often had this air of inaccessibility. A lot of this might be the sheer number of Dune books, there being something like maybe like in the number of like around 20 or so written between Frank and Brian Herbert, and just the girth of each one. It may also be the emotions that fans of the series show whenever the subject comes up that makes me feel much more like an outsider to the whole thing. And it's likely, albeit probably very unfairly, needed to be blamed on Lynch's 1984 adaptation. That version of Dune is so very goofy, for a lack of a better word. It's trying hard to have this lived-in world like the Star Wars trilogy had back then, and it had so many characters that it was almost impossible to stick with one character long enough to really kind of give a crap about anyone. It's so overstuffed that it shuts my brain down within minutes every time. I can usually stick through Virginia Madsen's opening exposition dump. I can usually get a few minutes into the movie, but then soon the film puts my brain into mental arrest and I end up cross-eyed and drooling and just wanting the whole experience to end. But this time around, we have French-Canadian director Denis Villeneuve coming into the series with what seems to be a much more earnest attempt at an adaptation that should be at least a little bit more accessible, right? More on that here in a minute. But Villeneuve made one of my very favorite science fiction films of this entire century so far, Arrival. That film earned him a nomination for Best Director at the 2016 Academy Awards, and he backed that up by making maybe the second best science fiction film of the century, and one that gets better every time I see it, Blade Runner 2049. Now, while Villeneuve isn't exclusively a sci-fi director, he clearly has the chops. So how does that work for Dune? Well, to be honest with you, it's a difficult tale to pierce. Dune has a long history of being an unfilmable series of books, and it's easy to understand why. This film is over 2.5 hours long. There are about a dozen important characters right up front that you need to know about. There are 2 houses that serve within this vast universal empire. There are relationships and betrayals and desire to possess the spice found on the planet Arrakis. The denseness is going to be difficult to wade through if you don't really have a very specific taste for or affinity toward this series. At best, You can only really know that there's a young heir to House Atreides named Paul, played by Timothée Chalamet, and you could possibly sympathize with a kid who isn't so sure that he wants to take the head of the family when his father passes it to him, either by death or by whatever. Now, his mother is also something special, but it's really kind of hard to explain. The film makes it very difficult to truly understand the vast depths of this story and what these special powers these people have. So again, we have House Atreides, their rivals, which is House Harkonnen, and their heads are dukes in the Empire, and the Emperor that we don't see, we only hear about, is maybe a bit fickle and easy to be made an enemy of you. There's these spooky nuns that serve the Empire as well, and they use very special powers called the Voice. And while it is Paul's mother who has been trying to teach her son, Paul, how to use this power in order to become this fabled messiah of some sort, we're not really told what this power is. So we have to kind of navigate a bunch of this film with only hushed conversation over what things are meant to be or meant to mean and what it could mean for a future of a universe that we barely know anything about. It's like being dropped off at the party of a friend. You might know a guy over there, or you may have seen your pal talk to that girl over there once at a random concert that you just so happen to all be at once. But they're talking in ways they understand, but you have little to no reference for. The music is telling us something is important and meaningful, but we're still kind of kept at arm's length. And it's kind of the major problem with this movie. I prefer the look and feel and the more earnest attempt at telling the story, as well as it possibly can be told, I guess, as opposed to the 1984 Lynch movie. But what of it I can honestly retain after that movie completely and totally oozed out with the rest of my brain out of every hole out of my head. But I think there are things about this that I do prefer. I mean, this movie certainly has the lived-in look that, say, the original Star Wars film had in 1977. And that helps with the universe building you're creating in this movie. However, the film becomes rather pedantic, too. A lengthy stretch of this movie is taken up by Paul Atreides and his father, Duke Leto, learning about Arrakis. How does one survive on this desert planet? How do the spice harvesting machines work? What are the politics between the Emperor's assigned houses sent to rule the planet Arrakis and the freemen who live on Arrakis? How do spice farmers work against the potential of the deadly giant sandworms that are attracted by the rhythmic sounds made by the machinery? All of these things might be something you'd think about or read about in either the source material or a novelization of a movie, but it's hard to handle in a film. Some of it can be there, and it certainly leads to the first exciting scene of the movie in which Paul and one of his mentors, Gurney, have to escape a worm attack, but it's like asking someone if they ever thought about exactly how Luke's family farmed for moisture on Tatooine in Star Wars. It's something you can certainly think about beyond watching the movie, but it's not really something you should see or have to be explained. So a lot of those pedantic sequences end up delaying the one thing that should take a little bit more of the center stage in a movie, the plot. Again, we're almost halfway through the movie before you realize what the actual master plan is. And that is that the Empire and the Emperor hands Arrakis over to House Atreides to ultimately force them to fail and therefore be weak and susceptible to the ire of the Emperor so that House Harkonnen can then be the favored power of the Empire or something to that effect. It's all very shrouded in mystery and visions and heavy talk about things that mean something to the people who read these books, but very difficult to penetrate if you are not a built-in member of that fandom. Ultimately, the major downfall of this movie isn't that it's hard to access as an outsider to the source material. It isn't that it takes a long time to get going before we understand the plot of Harkonnen setting up Atreides to fail on Arrakis to gain favor with the Emperor. It's not the encyclopedic and pedantic tone and pacing the film takes in the first half. No, all of these things mean something to someone and certainly would be appreciated by those who are the fans of the original novels. Where this becomes more of a chore to get through is when you realize that everything happening here is based on a betrayal within House Atreides. It's a decision made under duress by a guy who should be smart enough to ultimately know that the bad guy isn't going to honor his end of the agreement. It's a betrayal that ultimately means nothing. While that is an everyday sort of occurrence, I suppose, it's not good for your movie that has such a large impact. But wait, there's more. The betrayal does have a backup plan. So when Duke Leto is betrayed, he's given something that should, in turn, dish out an ultimate reversal of that betrayal to kill the head of House Harkonnen, right? Nah, don't worry about that. Our main bad guy kind of miraculously survives that. So everything in this movie is predicated on a betrayal that means nothing and an opposite betrayal that doesn't work. Death, destruction, all-out war between a powerful army and those who have an army, and then later against another group of native dwellers who are historically bullied. It's all based on failure. And while all of that does make me realize that Dune just isn't really a thing that's for me, and maybe it makes me less of a nerd than I think I am, but all the colonial and empirical and this generational power sort of dynamics that's in this is just kind of distasteful. And all that said, maybe there aren't necessarily bad things here. While my co-host of the weekly Film Seizure podcast, Jason Oliver, disagrees with me on this, I do find this movie to look right. Quote unquote right. He prefers the David Lynch set design over the more natural looking landscapes and such, but that shouldn't be much of a surprise. He'd prefer pretty much anything Lynch does over just about anyone else. I do like the Hans Zimmer score, though I would say that his score for No Time to Die has my preference. For this year, at least, I can at least say there's a beauty to the score. And I really liked Jason Momoa's Duncan Idaho character. He had a heart and life to his performance that was mostly missing from pretty much every other actor. The movie just kind of seemed to come alive when he was there. And I'd really hesitate to call this a bad movie. It really isn't. Like I said, much of this will mean something to those who consumed Herbert's Dune stories and always wanted to see this come to life somehow. It's technically just fine. It doesn't really appeal to me, though. Considering this is only the first part of what's likely to be another at least 150 minutes worth of movie, I'm fine with what I got here. I don't think that I'll be looking to return to the spice-filled dunes of Arrakis anytime soon. So with that, I think it is time to bury this review in the sand. This movie is not terrible. I would say if I were to give it a grade, I'd probably put it maybe around C or C minus. It's just not really my flavor of science fiction. But I completely understand those fans of the series really liking this. But check out new episodes of Film Seizure hosted by Jason Oliver, Chuck Moore, and myself each Wednesday morning, and new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by finding us at Film Seizure. You can find us on several podcast platforms like SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Audible. You can also follow the show on YouTube if that's where you'd like to listen to these various shows that we do. In about a week's time, I'll be back with a look at one of the more highly anticipated movies, at least for me, Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho. So until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.